All right, Bert, we just played your report that you had going back to Sunday, talking about how the team feels about what's been going on this season. You would use the word embarrassed. You said that's not the right word. Resigned is the right word. Resigned at this point. So if the team is resigned, do they care what happens in the final month of the season?
Oh, yeah.
Are they still evaluating what their situation is? When you say resigned, it's like, okay, we resigned and we're just accepting of the year. I mean,
I think they're resigned to the results is what I meant by that. Like, I don't think that they're, look, do I think Robert and Jonathan and the powers that be over there are happy that like they're no longer on the marquee? No, but that's somewhere they've been for a few years now. What I meant by resigned was resigned to that result, like resigned to the result that, again, like I've used his name. I hate, like, it's no offense to him, but like Adam Archuleta is calling a lot of their games. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of where they are right now. And I think they're resigned to the fact that this is what they signed up for in a lot of ways with a first-year head coach and hanging on to Bill the way that they did and continuously trying to give Bill the chance to win in the here and the now, which I think, in the end wound up, making it so whenever he left, you would have to go through a pretty hard reset, which is where they are right now.
Are you suggesting there is no way that they consider moving on from Jerod Mayo at the end of the year?
I'd be shocked. Like, I'd be really surprised, guys. I don't know. I think, like, I just think so much of it is when I think part of it does have to do with them, I think, which is like, I think one reason why Jason Garrett lasted 9.5 years in Dallas is because Jerry had invested so much into developing him into the Cowboys head coach. And I think like a similar dynamic exists here. Like they've invested a lot over the years into preparing Jerod Mayo to make him the head coach. And then he wound up the head coach a year or two earlier than they ever expected it to happen. And so like you sort of signed up for the bumps that you're going through this year, that he would still be learning how to do it. And I think, part of it is, part of it is like their own fault too, is, like giving Jerod the deal they gave him before this year, like made it so I think Bill in some ways resented Jerod that last year. And so there was going to be no like mentorship in that final year where, Bill was going to sort of open things up to Jerod and help to teach him how to be a head coach. And quite honestly, like where else does Jerod have to go on that? Like that's why Jerod had to go to Mike Tomlin and go to Tony Dungy, because he didn't have like someone kind of holding his hand his last couple of years as an assistant, teaching him how to be a head coach. So, I think it's sort of where they're at. And that's what I mean by resigned is like when you did that, when you chose Jerod Mayo to be your head coach, this sort of what you signed up for is there were going to be some bumps along the way and there were going to be some growing pains, and they're going through those growing pains now.
So what you've described is that in 2023, they created some level of dysfunction, if not a great level of dysfunction, between the head coach, Bill Belichick, and one of his assistants in Jerod Mayo. They then made Jerod Mayo the head coach, knowing that he had never done it before and understanding that there would be some bumps along the way. And now they've had a full year to sort of watch and evaluate him. How long does that last? Right? If it's not now, if you can't consider it now, when are you allowed to consider it?
Consider moving on from him?
Yeah. When is that allowed? When does that become okay?
End of next year, I would say. Like I just think I think you have to give a guy, again, like in this position, 2 years. This was never, and I've said this a million times, and I don't know why it doesn't get through. This was never going to be a single season rebuild. You could have brought in, whoever, named the coach, and it probably wouldn't have been. Like where they were from a roster standpoint, it was a dilapidated roster. I mean, go and look at their draft picks over the last 5 years. This wasn't a problem that just creeped up on them in a year or two. This is a problem that built over Bill's last 4 or 5 years. Like the drafts are black holes of talent. And like go back and look at the 19 and 20 and 21 drafts, and those should be the guys going into year 4, year 5, year 6, who you're giving big money to, who you're extending, who you're building your roster. And instead they're still chasing the mistakes of Isaiah Wynn and N'Keal Harry. It's just, the roster was in disrepair. And like when you hand a first year head coach, that sort of rebuild, expecting him to snap his fingers and get into the playoff picture is patently insane. And I understand everybody needs like stuff to talk about because football drives the buses.
Well, what about Washington and the year they're having? And they were a worse team than you.
Right. I would look at Washington and I would look at the details there. Okay. They hired an experienced head coach in Dan Quinn who'd been to a Super Bowl before.
Oh,
Dan Quinn brought a boatload of his own players with him. So go right down the list. Dante Fowler, Dorrance Armstrong to play the edges, Bobby Wagner to play middle linebacker. They bring in Zach Ertz, who had played for Cliff Kingsbury in Arizona. They have a personnel executive there, Scott Fitter, who is the GM in Carolina. He brings Frankie Louvu and Jeremy Chin with him, who are two key pieces to the defense. It's not apples to apples. And on top of that, they're drafting a quarterback.
Wait. No,
they're drafting a quarterback. They're drafting a quarterback who had 55 college starts.
Bert, the quarterback's a wash. The Patriots have just as good of a quarterback now. I don't care about the quarterback there. They both got good quarterbacks.
Jaden Daniels has had a better year than I love Drake May.
Of
Jaden
course.
Daniels has had a better year.
I'm talking about long term. I'm saying they both have quarterbacks. They both found quarterbacks.
They both do.
They both X each other out.
If you're comparing like Washington now to New England now, there's a million differences.
They were in the same spot though, going back to a year ago. They were in the same spot.
But then you're saying, okay, go hire Dan Quinn.
I'm
right?
saying hire someone better than Jerod Mayo and hire someone better than Elliott Wolf.
That's fine. But I'm not dealing with the hypothetical. I'm dealing with what is now. So if your solution, seriously, honestly, Beetle,
I'm not talking about moving forward. I'm saying if you're analyzing what has gone on the last year,
right.
The spot the Commanders were in at the end of last season and the spot the Patriots were in are not very different. And look at how the two teams have handled it since.
The Commanders had a completely clean break. From a failing administration. They had a new owner.
They
had a new owner.
Yes.
A completely clean break. A new owner. The head coach there failed. The general manager failed. They're both gone. But one of them's still in the building. But
it proves that you can clean house and have a good start.
No, you can.
Yeah.
You can. If that's the path. If that's the path you want to take, that's fine. That's not the path they took.
No, I know. I think they were wrong. I think they're
maybe they were wrong.
They're being proven wrong by teams like the Commanders.
That is a fair argument. Like that you took that path and that was the wrong path to take. That you should have just blown the whole thing up. Like you can have that argument.
Yeah, I think they're paying a price.
Holding Jerod Mayo to the standard of Dan Quinn in Washington is I don't think fair. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Jerod Mayo has been put in a bad spot by front office that over the years has been bad and continues to be bad.
There have also been winnable games, though, on the schedule, despite the fact that the roster isn't good.
Oh, yeah, you can recognize that Jerod Mayo hasn't done a good job as head coach, even with the depleted roster. Right?
No, but it's not like look, we can play that game and we can look at this game and that game and they should have won this, they should have won that. And
that
then
is
you
the
can
game we play every day here. That is the game.
But then you can go through their wins and say this exact same thing, right? Do you think they beat Cincinnati right now? Cincinnati would beat them by 30 right now.
No, I think in the early going and in week one you have a chance to knock out.
In week one you beat them and you beat them by the skin of your teeth. Right? Yeah. So we can do that if you want to go through, and I can turn them into a 1-win team just as fast as you turn them into a 6-win team.
I'm not trying to turn them into a 6-win team, but I'd like to hear how they're a 1-win team. I could do that.
I think you could get there really easily, couldn't you?
I think
their wins weren't blowouts, and then the expectation becomes, which is this is the idiocy that I listen to. Then the equation becomes, well, now you're expecting a first year head coach to win all of those games. Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not.
On what planet is that going to happen?
No, I'm not expecting that. I did not expect there to be smooth sailing. I expect a first-year head coach to have some bumps along the way. It just feels like his bumps are very frequent. And he's a guy who, in-game, doesn't have a firm grasp on things, and that's typically a really bad sign.
And I know it doesn't help anybody right now in the here and the now and getting excited to play a game in Arizona in 10 days or 11 days or whatever it is, but the reality is the bet for the Crafts on Jerod Mayo wasn't a bet on 2024. It was a bet on 2026. And it sucks to hear that, but that's what it was, Now, sometimes those bets work out faster. The bet, for the Rams on Sean McVay worked out way faster than they ever thought it would. So like I think if you're like I think if we're arguing where the Patriots are versus where Washington is, like I think you can argue the decisions they made in January and how to build it, right? Like that's where you can make that argument. But comparing them now, like that's not apples to apples.
Yeah,
like it's just a totally different
Okay,
approach.
so I think he's obviously back next year too, Jerod Mayo. But what if they get absolutely blown out in the next 4 games, like the Miami game?
If the team quits on him, that's where you put yourself in jeopardy.
Okay, that's losing. That's losing the team, then, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Like that's where that's where I think it normally happens. You know what I mean? Like I think like when you see coaches like Frank Reich, like who I love, Frank Reich's like one of the, and you know him, Zoe, like one of the best people in football, right?
Good football guy. Yep.
Like and did a pretty decent job in Indianapolis as the head coach. Like he lost the team in Carolina last year. That's why they fired him. You know, so generally when guys go one and done in a place, it's because they lost the team.
We've done this song and dance with Jerod Mayo half a dozen times this year where he will say something and then he has to take it back and say, I shouldn't have said that. The same way he did on Monday morning after dropping this line. Credit to Greg Bedard, by the way, who yesterday on Felger Maz pointed out something that I think that most of us are missing because we just can't see the forest through the trees. He said, the question was about why didn't you think about taking a timeout earlier in the drive to slow down the drive, save some time, stop the clock. And he said that's what he was responding to. But how about the fact that in the moment with 17 seconds left, he did the polar opposite of what the Patriots did in that Super Bowl against Seattle, which was he took the timeout. Maybe the Colts would have taken the timeout and Shane Steichen would have realized he was running out of time on the play clock. But he called the timeout for them with 17 seconds when the Colts obviously needed a timeout there and needed to regroup. He did it for them. He did the polar opposite of what won the Super Bowl. So he got it wrong kind of twice, not calling a timeout earlier in the drive and then calling it when he should have let it go and see what the Colts did with it and see if the Colts screwed up and took a penalty there because they weren't paying attention, because they've got an offensive-minded head coach who's buried in the play sheet, Mike McDaniel style, taking a silly delay a game penalty because his head's not in the game. So I thought that was a good observation that I just wasn't even thinking in those terms. But here it is, Jerod Mayo taking something back again. He's taking another thing back. So Jerod Mayo is going to have to make some changes to his staff because when you win 3,
I agree,
maybe 4 games in an NFL season, typically everybody doesn't survive. Bert, you've been covering the league for a long time, right? Pretty safe to say that?
Yeah, and we've seen it. Like I think we've brought up the examples before. Sean McDermott was one where, he had Rick Dennison, who was like one of the original Shanahan guys as his offensive coordinator. Didn't work out. That's when Daboll wound up there in his second year. Dan Campbell made a change with his offensive coordinator, firing Anthony Lynn. That's when Ben Johnson became the OC there. So, and I think like in a lot of cases, like it's on the head coach to have a good pulse for what his team needs. The other thing Dan Campbell did through his first 2 years was hang on to Aaron Glenn as his defensive coordinator.
Right.
And that wound up being really smart. And there was a ton of pressure on him to fire Glenn, but he stuck with him. So while he fired Anthony Lynn on one hand.
Do you see that potentially being a scenario here? Because you got a defensive-minded head coach in Jerod, and to me, this last month, the defense has gotten progressively worse.
I think you can't leave the defensive staff alone. Like that's my opinion on it. Like I actually think, I don't know, guys, like the offense looks pretty good.
It's the best it's looked all year.
I think that they're getting better. And I think the quarterback, like there's a lot of things that you see with him that you didn't see at North Carolina. So like I would be hesitant to just flip the apple cart upside down on the quarterback. I don't think that's the right approach. Now, could you tweak the offensive staff? Yeah, I think you could tweak the offensive staff if you needed to. But I think with defense, you look at it and it's, all right, like what player can you name on the defense that's developed, that's come along? Like where is there a guy who's kind of emerging as a star who they're getting more out of that guy than they were at the beginning of the year. And it's not just Drake May on offense that, qualifies. I think, Antonio Gibson's looked better. They're using Austin Hooper a little bit more. He had the big catch on Sunday, I think you see guys coming along on offense. Where is that really happening on defense? So it's scheme, it's talent development. It's like we invested in those hybrids. You guys we've talked about that, like where they invest in like the Bill specific players, the Peppers, the Duggars, the Mapus. Like, are you able to use those guys the same way Bill does? Because that's why, a lot of cases, guys like that didn't have as much value to other teams as they did to the Patriots, because Bill had a unique way of using those guys. I think all those things are fair questions to ask. And I think there's a big picture question here too, is like, okay, you hired a defensive line coach to be your coordinator. Zoe, you can answer this. How often, like, is it that the D-line coach becomes the coordinator on that side of the ball? Rarely, right?
Rarely.
Because it's just they generally don't know the back end well enough, right?
It's like Brendan Daly. Like, he's not. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
So you've said, Bert, you've said, over the years when we've talked about coaching changes here or elsewhere, that these calls don't begin in January; they begin in December,
right?
Don't they?
Yeah.
You start mobilizing a little bit. You start calling.
Yeah.
You start checking around. You start back channeling on a number of levels. That's when coaching calls happen. So, are those calls happening right now?
So, like, yes is the answer. Those calls do start to happen, pretty early on. And, like, I don't know specifically that they're happening for the Patriots, but, certainly coaching agents have an idea of when their guys are in trouble, when jobs might come available. And I don't know that we're quite there yet, but there's a meeting in Dallas next week. There's a league meeting in Dallas next week where a lot of the coaching agents show up to that, and some of that stuff gets set in motion. And that's a meeting they have every year there, where a lot of the personnel guys there are there, and just kind of like a lot of things pointed towards the next year are discussed. So I don't think you'd be far off from that sort of thing. And I also I think
the second day in a row Beatles brought this up.
What?
Here's the other thing.
No, just asking.
A big meeting next week, coaches, agents. I don't know. Just this is the time of year this stuff happens. That's all.
So I would say the other thing is like I'd question Jerod's decision making on making the D-line coach the coordinator, right? I'd also question his decision making on not backstopping that spot the way he backstopped the offensive coordinator spot. Like, and we've talked about that too, right? Like they backstopped Alex Van Pelt with Ben McAdoo. So they have like two guys who've held the title before.
Aren't they supposed to backstop with Jerod Mayo?
Isn't he the backstop? Yeah.
And that's the thing is like, but he's and he should be, but he's obviously
not
still
good.
trying to figure out how to become the head coach.
Oh.
You know what I mean? So do you want that? Like and I think, like, I don't know why they didn't bring in somebody experienced to help out on that side of the ball. Like, here's a name, Josh Boyer, who, like, he was the defensive coordinator in Miami. He did get fired there, but he comes from your system. He has worked here before. Why couldn't you hire somebody like him as a senior defensive assistant to try and give yourself some level of like just experience on that side of the ball? So when the new coordinator does hit some roadblocks, the head coach doesn't need to dive in there on a day-to-day basis. And I don't, like, honestly, like, I mean, Jerod was running the meetings before that. Like, Jerod would be the first time in that role too. Like, so you could say Jerod maybe would be the backstop. The problem is he hasn't really done that job either, So, like, that I think is kind of a glaring thing, especially if, like, and Jerod said this from the start, like, I want to be a walk-around head coach. Well, why the hell didn't you fortify the defensive side of the staff so you could do that?
Do you get to follow and keep an eye on those agents at that meeting next week? Do you get a chance to ever see, like, one of those agents talking to an owner and you're like, oh, I wonder what's going on there? Oh, or do they all do it under the cover of
Things do
darkness?
happen at that meeting, yeah.
Yeah, things do happen there. Bert, I pondered yesterday. I pondered it. That's all I did, Zoe. I pondered if at this time of year, even if you're not sure about what's going to happen with your head coach, or you intend to keep your head coach for next year, whether or not a team such as the New England Patriots would be checking in and just knowing who's out there and who's available and who's gonna be in the coaching carousel in a month. Don't the smart teams do that, Bert? Do they not?
I mean, yeah, like, are you talking about head coaches?
Yeah, talking about the top job, even if you don't want to fire your guy.
Well, I mean, like, and now we're talking about, like, the opportunity cost of not doing something, right? Which is, like, the opportunity cost potentially would be Mike Vrabel, which, like, I think your head coaching job is way more attractive now than it was 6 months ago because of the quarterback.
Sure is.
I think we can agree on that, right?
Yeah.
Like I think you went from like and I think it's also more attractive because whoever the next guy is wouldn't be following Bill. So if things do go poorly enough under Jerod, now you've sort of lifted that weight off that job too. Like I don't think it was a very attractive job in January because at that point you didn't have the quarterback. You had a long way to go with the roster, and whoever was next was going to have to follow Bill. I think some of those things have obviously changed. The roster's still crappy, but like some of those things have changed. And so now the job has become more attractive. So do you strike while the iron's hot? Like I don't blame you guys for asking that question. Like I don't. Like I think like it is a fair question if you view Mike Vrabel, like I do, as like a top 6, 7, 8 head coach in the NFL in football. And you have a pretty good idea that he's going to be a head coach next year, which means if you move on from Jerod Mayo after 25 or 26, he won't be available to you. Well, then like that's a fair equation to do, right? Like in your head where it's like, okay, is it worth riding this out with Jerod if the cost is having a shot at Mike Vrabel?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is no. I would go after Mike Vrabel. Yeah. No, it's not worth riding it out with Jerod. No.
Right, because I mean, the thing about Mike is Mike doesn't strike me as like sentimental, as far as like this being a homecoming or anything like that.
I don't know.
Like,
he sure sounded sentimental about it when he was here last season.
I don't think I honestly I don't think he views it that way right now. Like based on where they are right now, like my guess would be like he would view it. He's going to take based on what happened with him in Tennessee, he is going to take a very cold, hard look at wherever his next opportunities come because of what went wrong there and how ownership was involved in that and how the front office was involved in that and how things got tangled up. Like, I think Mike is going to be like I think he's going to be insistent that it's set up a certain way for him to go somewhere.
Yeah, I'd give him full control the way Jerod Mayo had it. I mean, the way Bill Belichick had it and Jerod Mayo doesn't have it. That's what I would do. I'd be willing to do it.
I think
not the conventional method these days. It definitely doesn't happen anymore. But
I think, and I'm not saying he would want full control where he's sitting in the film room and breaking down 7th round guards.
He's got the final say.
But I think like structure would be important to him after what he just went through, and so like I think that would be a bigger factor than sentimentality having been a player here. Because remember, like. His exit wasn't exactly pretty either, so
it's a great sell. You can have control of your roster and you can pick your GM and you have Drake May. That's the sell to Mike Vrabel.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. It's a good package.
So like that's the one thing is like, to me, like that's the opportunity cost of sticking with Jerod Mayo. If you do stick with Jerod Mayo, and they fully plan again to stick with Jerod Mayo, and I don't think it's the wrong decision, but the opportunity cost of that could be Mike Vrabel.
Hey, if you like that clip, check out more videos from Zolak and Bertrand right here. For more Patriots analysis and opinion, hit this playlist. And for all the latest from the Sports Hub, download the app at 985thesportshub.com.